This video takes a closer look at the characterization of surface properties of materials, with a particular focus on roughness. In addition to specifying dimensional tolerances for the manufacturing of a component, surface property specifications are also required in certain applications. The illustrated example of a sliding rail shows, as an example, the specification of a maximum allowable roughness profile height of RZ equals 6.3 micrometers. The surface symbol is placed directly on the corresponding surface. The surface symbol can also point with an arrow to the dimension line of a specific geometry that is to have a certain surface property. In the illustrated case, the surface specification indicates not only the maximum roughness height to be achieved, but also the machining process by which this is to be attained, in this case, reaming. Furthermore, in some cases it may even be necessary to prohibit the machining of a surface altogether because it has been specially treated in a previous step, for example with a special coating, or because the surface already possesses the required properties and must therefore not be damaged during the current process. Before discussing the roughness values in detail, the various surface symbols and their meanings will be examined more closely. Some of these we have already encountered. The basic symbol for specifying a required surface texture is a check mark-like symbol drawn with a thin solid line. In contrast to the old standard ISO 1302, the new standard ISO 21920 adds a horizontal line to all surface symbols. This way, it can be immediately recognized from drawings whether they were created according to the old or the new standard, since the interpretation of the specifications differs slightly between the two. In the depicted basic form of the surface symbol, no specific manufacturing process is prescribed for producing the surface. If no material removal is allowed from the surface, a circle is placed inside the checkmark symbol. However, if the lower part of the checkmark is extended into a triangle, the surface must be produced by a material removing process. If the surface must not exceed a certain roughness, the corresponding roughness value is indicated below the checkmark. We will discuss the different parameters in more detail later. If the machining process to achieve the specified surface texture is also to be prescribed, it is indicated above the horizontal line of the checkmark. If a lower limit for the surface property is specified that must not be undercut, for example when a minimum roughness is required, the letter L is placed before the parameter value. If in addition to the minimum value an upper limit is set that must not be exceeded, this maximum value is marked with the letter U. Basically, during machining processes, depending on the cutting edge geometry, feed rate, and cutting depth, grooves form on the surface at regular intervals. For example, turning produces a kind of fine thread on the surface. This can cause, under certain circumstances, lubricants to be transported outward under a seal, as the fine thread grooves act like a microscopic feed screw. In such cases, it may be useful to specify a certain orientation of the grooves on the surface to prevent this. The indication of the groove direction is no longer made to the right of the triangle as in the old standard, but above the check mark in the new standard. The perpendicular symbol in our case denotes grooves perpendicular to the projection plane in which the surface symbol is placed. A parallel or crossed groove direction, as well as grooves running in various directions, can also be specified. It is also possible to require that a surface must have no grooves. If grooves should run as concentrically as possible toward the center of a surface, this is indicated by the letter C. It is also possible to specify a radial groove direction outward by the letter R. The new standard additionally provides the possibility to specify the direction in which the surface profile should be recorded during later measurement. The profile orientation can be parallel, perpendicular, concentric, or at a specified angle to the prevailing groove direction. If no indication is given, the surface profile should be recorded in the direction in which the greatest roughness is expected. Let us now take a closer look at the placement of surface symbols in drawings. These symbols are always placed on the surface to be machined. They must be readable from below or from the right. Surface symbols may also be placed on a leader line with an arrow pointing externally to the surface. The surface symbol may also be placed on the dimension line of a measurement or point to the dimension line with an arrow. It is also permissible to draw surface symbols extending from edges of the component. Surface specifications apply not only to the surface on which the symbol is placed, but also to the adjacent fillets, unless explicitly stated otherwise. When two surfaces transition into each other via fillet or chamfer, the rougher of the two surface roughness values applies to the fillet or chamfer. In the illustrated case, a maximum roughness height of RZ equals 16 micrometers would therefore apply to the fillet. For complex surface specifications, a simplified notation is permitted. The detailed explanation of the simplification must be located either near the component or near the title block of the drawing. If there are multiple views of a geometry, the surface symbol is always placed in the view where the dimension is also shown. If a geometry with a required surface property appears multiple times on a component, for example in holes, the surface symbol is only applied once in conjunction with the dimensioning of one geometry. When a general surface property is required for the majority of surfaces on a component and only individual surfaces deviate from this, the primarily used surface symbol is placed near the title block, and the deviating surface specifications are given in parentheses thereafter. The surface specifications in parentheses may also be replaced by a basic symbol. For specifying the surface roughness of threads, the surface symbol is placed on the major diameter of both external and internal threads. For a workpiece surface to be treated, for example by coating or hardening, the surface symbol is drawn on the wide chain line. After becoming familiar with the various surface symbols and their placement in drawings, we will now take a closer look at the parameters used to characterize surface roughness. These are very commonly encountered in practice. For example, sliding surfaces for guideways should be relatively smooth to minimize wear. Contact surfaces for seals should also be relatively smooth to prevent scratching of the seals. Furthermore, with very high roughness, there is a risk that the seal cannot penetrate deeply enough into the grooves of the surface, thus failing to achieve a proper sealing effect. The load-bearing capacity of surfaces also depends on their roughness. A rough surface generally exhibits limited load-bearing capacity, as contact is confined to a small number of surface asperities rather than being distributed over the functional surface area. In a press fit, these roughness peaks are gradually flattened under load over time, a process known as settling, causing the connection to lose its hold. In such cases, it is therefore important to specify the maximum permissible roughness values. Surface roughness ultimately represents deviations from the ideal geometry of a component. The ideal geometry is specified by the technical drawing but cannot be realized exactly in practice. Geometric deviations of a surface can be classified into 6 orders, each representing progressively finer deviations. First-order geometric deviations are deviations from the ideal form, such as flatness, roundness, or straightness deviations. These form deviations can be caused by incorrect clamping of the workpiece or progressive tool wear. Residual stresses released during the machining process can also lead to form deviations. Likewise, significant temperature changes, such as those occurring during hardening, can cause distortion of the component and thus form deviations. These form deviations may be superimposed by waviness caused, for example, by vibrations of the tool or workpiece. Such vibrations can occur due to imbalances if the tool or workpiece is mounted off-center. The resulting vibrations lead to more or less pronounced periodic waviness of the surface. Chatter marks on the workpiece surface during milling are an example of such vibrations. These waviness deviations are classified as second-order geometric deviations and have smaller dimensions than form deviations. The waviness can in turn be overlaid by grooves formed by the geometry of the cutting edge. During turning, and especially roughing, these grooves are often visible to the naked eye on the workpiece surface and can also be clearly felt with a fingernail. The groove depth is influenced, among other factors, by the feed rate and depth of cut. Such a third-order geometric deviation is generally referred to as roughness. On closer inspection, usually only possible under a microscope, these grooves are superimposed with further roughness features. One can observe rills, scales, or peaks resulting from the chip formation process. Depending on whether, for example, a continuous chip or segmented chip is produced, the material removal leaves differently pronounced rills in the microscopic surface. These microscopic rills are referred to as fourth-order geometric deviations. An even more detailed examination reveals further roughness on the surface. Here, the microstructure comes into focus, which may undergo microscopic changes due to chemical processes such as corrosion, leading to roughening of the microstructure on a microscopic scale. These microstructural roughness features are called fifth-order geometric deviations. One order of magnitude smaller leads finally to the atomic structure of the microstructure and thus the lattice structure of metals. Even such a lattice structure is not ideally formed but contains defects. These atomic deviations from the ideal lattice structure are referred to as sixth-order geometric deviations. These deviations are influenced by the crystallization process during solidification of metals. It should be noted that in practice all 6 aforementioned orders of geometric deviations overlap and thus determine the actual shape of a surface. However, for roughness, only the 3rd to 5th orders of geometric deviations are relevant. Only these constitute the roughness of a surface. These roughness features are usually determined using a so-called Stylus Profilometer. We will examine this in more detail in the following. In the Stylus Profiling Method, the surface of a workpiece is scanned in one direction using a very fine diamond tip. The up and down movement of the tip while scanning the surface is inductively recorded by a measurement system. The force with which the tip presses on the surface is only a few millinewtons. The stylus tip typically has a radius of 2, 5, or 10 micrometers. Essentially, roughness can only be measured as far as the stylus tip can penetrate into the structures. Depending on the measurement conditions, a length of about 4 millimeters is scanned at a speed of approximately 0.5 millimeters per second. Because vibrations occur at the stylus when passing over edges in the roughness profile, which can distort the measurement results, such short wavelength oscillations are filtered out by a so-called low-pass filter via software. We will discuss the filtering in more detail later, as it is central to the significance and comparability of surface roughness measurements. The filtered up and down movements of the stylus result in a recorded two-dimensional primary profile. This so-called P-profile contains not only the surface roughness but is also superimposed by waviness and partly formed deviations. This waviness profile is called the W-profile. These long wavelength oscillations of the W-profile, which are not due to roughness but rather to the aforementioned waviness and form deviations of the surface, are also filtered out. This filtering is also performed by the software during the measurement acquisition using a high-pass filter. Through this filtering, the waviness is effectively smoothed out, and the actual roughness profile is obtained, also called the R-profile. The roughness is thus recorded relative to this long wavelength W profile, which is then transformed into a straight line. This reference line for the roughness is also called the mean line, forming the horizontal x-axis in the diagram. The roughness is usually plotted in micrometers on the vertical z-axis. The recorded roughness profile now serves as the basis for determining various roughness parameters. The most important ones will be explained in more detail in the following. It should be noted that the measured section is always preceded by a certain startup length and followed by a certain runoff length. This is to avoid unwanted vibration influences from the filters when starting on the surface as well as when stopping the measuring tip. Let us now consider the determination of the so-called maximum roughness height RZ, based on the obtained R profile. For this purpose, the total measured length is first divided into 5 equal section lengths LSC1 to LSC5. Within each section length, a rectangle is formed whose height extends from the lowest point of the profile curve to the highest point, thus fully encompassing the respective roughness section. The height of a rectangle is referred to as the profile height. In this way, we obtain 5 individual profile heights RZ1 to RZ5. For the first section length, for example, a profile height of RZ1 equals 10.96 micrometers is obtained. For the second section length, we get a profile height of RZ2 equals 9.81 micrometers, and for the following section lengths, heights of 13.84, 11.88, and 10.38 micrometers respectively. It should be noted that surface parameters as well as profile heights are always measured and specified in micrometers. After determining these maximum individual profile heights, the average is calculated by first adding them and then dividing by the number of section lengths, which is 5. In this way, we obtain an average maximum profile height of 11.37 micrometers. According to the new standard, this parameter is called the maximum height RZ. However, note that this roughness parameter does not describe the absolute maximum height of the profile, but ultimately represents an average of the maximum individual heights of the 5 section lengths. This is intended to prevent a single profile outlier from excessively influencing the parameter. The former designation of this averaged maximum profile height was average roughness depth. This averaged maximum height of the roughness profile is determined and output directly by the software of the profilometer. Note that for our measured surface, a profile height of a maximum of 6.3 micrometers is specified according to the drawing. Therefore, we would need to rework the surface suitably, for example by grinding. So note, the maximum height of the roughness profile RZ, formerly called average roughness depth, describes the average maximum height of the roughness over 5 section lengths, each measured from the lowest point of a profile valley to the highest point of a profile peak. As already indicated, There is also a roughness parameter in this context that does not average the 5 measured individual heights, but instead specifies the maximum value from the 5 individual measurements. This roughness parameter was referred to as Rmax in the old standard and, in our case, occurs in the third section length and amounts to 13.84 micrometers. However, the new standard now prescribes a different method as a substitute for this maximum value. For this purpose, one section length is moved over the entire evaluation length. The resulting largest profile height is now referred to as the maximum height per section RZX. Such a definition of maximum roughness is significantly more meaningful than determining the maximum value within 5 arbitrarily defined section lengths. This can lead to different results, since the maximum value according to the new definition does not necessarily have to lie within a fixed section length, but can also span across 2 section lengths and is still captured when the profile is scanned. If instead of determining the individual profile heights from the single section lengths, the profile height is measured from the entire evaluation length, from the lowest point of all profile valleys to the highest point of all profile peaks, another characteristic value is obtained, called the total profile height RT. This total roughness height visually corresponds to the height of the rectangle that encloses the entire evaluation length. In our case, the deepest profile valley lies within section LSC1, and the highest profile peak is in the section LSC3. The total profile height in our case is 14.20 micrometers. The RT value thus represents the height of the band within which the measured roughness values of the entire evaluation length lie. It should be noted that the total roughness height RT, as an extreme value of the profile, is always greater than the averaged maximum profile height RZ, which as a mean value also captures smaller profile heights and is therefore lower. If the RT value is significantly larger than the RZ value, this indicates an inhomogeneous roughness profile, as it obviously contains a large roughness outlier. Conversely, if the values are close to each other, the surface exhibits a relatively homogeneous roughness profile without major deviations from the mean value. The individual heights RZ1 to RZ5 thus lie within a relatively narrow band defined by the height RT. At this point, a special characteristic of the maximum height RZ becomes apparent. Individual outliers in the roughness profile have a very large influence on the surface parameter, since within a section length only the extreme values count, which means the deepest valley and the highest peak. All other roughness values are disregarded. Significantly less sensitive to such outliers is the arithmetic mean of the roughness profile RA, which will be explained in more detail in the following, as it takes all roughness values of a profile into account in the calculation. The arithmetic mean height does not capture the individual extreme values of the profile heights, but rather the total deviations of the surface from the profile mean line. It does not matter whether it is a profile valley or a profile peak. It only measures how far the absolute value of the roughness is from the mean line. To do this, the deviation of the surface from the profile mean line is measured and summed at countless points. This value is then divided by the number of measurement points. In this way, a statement is made about the average deviation of the surface from the profile mean line. According to the standard, this parameter is called the arithmetic mean height RA. The former term, according to the old standard, was average roughness value. In fact, to determine the RA value, the respective deviations would have to be recorded at infinitely many points along the roughness profile to ensure that every surface roughness along the entire profile is captured. Mathematically, the calculation of the RA value is therefore performed by calculating the area enclosed by the roughness profile and the mean line. This corresponds to the integration of the absolute value of the roughness profile, which is then divided by the evaluation length LE. The following procedure is behind this. First, the roughness profile is divided into profile peaks above the mean line and profile valleys below the mean line. The profile valleys are then mirrored at the mean line. This essentially corresponds to taking the absolute value of the profile deviations. The resulting curve then indicates the magnitude of the deviation of the surface from the profile mean line, without distinguishing further between profile peaks and valleys. The area under the curve can now be imagined as a kind of modeling clay that is then flattened. This creates a rectangular area with the same surface area as our previously mountainous roughness profile. The height of this rectangular area corresponds to the RA value, representing the average deviation of the roughness profile from the profile mean line. This calculation is also performed by the software of the Stylus measuring device during data acquisition. So note, the arithmetic mean height RA, formerly average roughness, describes the average deviation of the roughness profile from the mean line. Since, unlike the RZ value, the RA value includes all surface irregularities in its calculation, individual outliers have a much smaller impact and influence the overall result to a significantly lesser extent. Consequently, the RZ value serves as a somewhat stricter criterion for assessing surface quality, as even a single pronounced irregularity can significantly increase the RZ value and lead to a violation of the specified roughness limit. In contrast, the RA value is less sensitive to such outliers, as their effect is averaged out by smaller variations in roughness. However, the informative value of the RA parameter with regard to surface quality is relatively limited compared to RZ. To better capture such profile outliers, another parameter called the root mean square height RQ is used. The main difference compared to the RA value is that the individual roughness values are squared before summation. Squaring causes individual large outliers to have a much greater impact and thus be disproportionately emphasized. Afterwards, the squared roughness values are summed up again, or the integral is formed, divided by the evaluation length LE, and the square root is taken. The root mean square height RQ basically corresponds to the standard deviation of the roughness distribution. The RQ value is therefore defined in a much more scientific way than the RA value, even though it is used much less frequently in practice. Another parameter of surface roughness is the mean peak height RP, formerly referred to as the mean smoothness depth. The peak height corresponds to the maximum height of a profile peak within a section length, measured from the profile mean line. The average of the peak heights from the 5 individual measurement segments is then referred to as the mean peak height RP. In our case, the mean peak height is 6.33 micrometers. This value indicates, in simple terms, the amount by which the surface would lower if, in an idealized scenario, the profile peaks were completely pressed into the profile valleys due to plastic deformation under load. As mentioned at the beginning of the video, this process is referred to as settling. The mean peak height thus represents the maximum amount of settling under load. Press-fit connections should therefore exhibit the lowest possible mean peak height in order to achieve a high material-bearing ratio of the surface and to avoid settling processes. Analogous to the peak height, which characterizes the heights of the profile peaks, the mean valley depth provides information about the profile depths. The mean valley depth was formerly referred to as the average groove depth. To determine the mean valley depth, the maximum depth of a profile valley within a section length is measured. Averaging this over the 5 individual measurement sections yields the mean valley depth RV. The sum of the mean peak height, RP, and the mean valley depth, RV, corresponds to the mean maximum height, RZ. The ratio of peak height to valley depth can be used to characterize surface textures. Let us consider the roughness profiles of 2 different surfaces, shown in red and blue. In both cases, the mean profile heights are the same. This becomes clear when we shift the blue profile slightly upward. Within each individual section length, we always have the same profile height measured from the deepest point of a valley to the highest point of a peak. Thus, for both roughness profiles, we obtain the same RZ value. Even upon closer examination of the surfaces, it becomes evident that both profiles enclose approximately the same areas with the profile mean line. Therefore, in both cases, we also obtain nearly identical RA values. Despite the nearly equal RZ and RA values, the 2 surfaces exhibit clear differences. This is where the mean peak height comes into play, which allows for a distinction between the 2 roughness profiles. The blue profile exhibits a relatively low mean peak height in relation to the total profile height, resulting in a bulging surface profile. If the ratio of RP to RZ is small, relatively broad and load-bearing material sections are located above the profile mean line, while narrow but deep grooves for lubricant retention are found below it. Such a roughness profile is therefore particularly well suited for lubricated bearing surfaces. The red profile, on the other hand, exhibits a relatively high mean peak height in relation to the total profile height, resulting in a rather sharp surface profile. If the ratio of RP to RZ is large, relatively narrow and less load-bearing material sections are located above the profile mean line, while wider but shallower grooves lie below it. Such a roughness profile is not very load-bearing but has a relatively high coefficient of friction. This example clearly shows that a single parameter is generally not sufficient to fully characterize a surface. In practice, however, usually only one parameter is specified, because typical manufacturing processes produce certain characteristic roughness profiles, allowing the surface to often be approximately described by just one parameter. The bearing material portions of a surface, as a function of surface depth, can also be explicitly represented in a diagram. In this diagram, the bearing material ratio is plotted along the horizontal axis, while the cut depth is shown on the vertical axis. To construct such a diagram, a horizontal cutting line is moved downward through the surface profile, and the resulting red bearing sections are related to the evaluation length. This provides information on the percentage of bearing material present at a given cut depth. At first, the material ratio is relatively low because only individual profile peaks bear the load. As the depth increases, the bearing ratio steadily grows and the curve gradually transitions into a straight line. Sooner or later, only a few deep grooves remain, which do not contribute to the bearing material. At this point, the increase in the bearing ratio slows down again. This way, the depicted material ratio curve is obtained, which is also known as the Abbott-Firestone curve. Especially when it comes to highly stressed bearing surfaces, such as cylinder running surfaces in combustion engines, such a diagram provides insights into the load-bearing behavior. From this, important surface parameters can be derived. First, a regression line is drawn through the linear portion of the material ratio curve. The intersections of this line with the edges of the diagram at 0% and 100% material ratio mark what is called the roughness core profile. This is illustrated as a yellow band within the roughness profile. The height of the roughness core profile is referred to as the core height RK. The height of the blue-marked area, which extends from a highest profile peak at 0% material ratio down to the roughness core profile, is referred to as the reduced peak height RPK. Similarly, adjoining the lower part of the core profile is the reduced valley depth RVK, which extends down to the deepest profile valley at 100% material ratio. We will examine these definitions of the reduced components in more detail shortly. For highly loaded bearing surfaces, the reduced peak height RPK should be as small as possible, as illustrated, so that the load-bearing roughness core profile is reached at a relatively shallow depth, preventing significant settling processes under load. Low reduced peak heights therefore indicate a rounded plateau-like surface profile. Other important parameters are the material ratios RMRK1 and RMRK2. These values characterize the smallest and largest material ratio of the core profile, and in our case are 8% and 90%, respectively. Let's briefly revisit the reduced peak height and reduced valley depth. In fact, the reduced peak height is not determined by the highest individual peak, since such a single peak would be flattened after one load in practice. Instead, the area of the profile peaks above the roughness core profile is first calculated. Then in the diagram, a triangle with the same area is formed, whose width corresponds to the material ratio RMRK1. The height of this area-equivalent triangle then represents the reduced peak height RPK. This definition of reduced peak height is much less sensitive to individual profile outliers. Analogously, the reduced valley depth is determined using an area-equivalent triangle. For this purpose, the area of the profile valleys below the core profile is first calculated. Then, in the diagram, a triangle with the same area is constructed, whose width corresponds to the distance between the material ratio RMRK2 and the diagram axis. The height of this triangle then represents the reduced valley depth RVK. This method also prevents a single outlier from having too much influence on the reduced valley depth. Let's take a closer look at the roughness profile once again. The previous characterization of the surface mainly focused on the so-called vertical parameters, meaning the description of the height of the peaks and the depth of the valleys. In practice, the already extensively explained parameters RA and RZ are frequently used. These are particularly applied to characterize non-periodic profiles, such as those found on ground or honed surfaces. In contrast, for periodic profiles, another important parameter comes into play, which describes the surface in the horizontal direction. This surface parameter is called the mean groove width. The mean groove width is only meaningful for periodic surface profiles. Periodic roughness profiles often arise during turning processes, where the cutting tool, combined with the circular cutting motion and linear feed, leaves periodic grooves on the surface. The mean groove width RSM describes the average distance between adjacent profile elements. Certain threshold values apply, from which a profile element is counted. Unless otherwise specified, the vertical threshold values are set at 10% of the peak height RP or valley depth RV. This 10% limit is shown as a yellow band in the diagram. A profile element is created, for example, whenever the roughness profile crosses the profile mean line from below to above. The length of such profile elements is designated as XS. However, the threshold values must be observed. A profile element is only actually counted if both a peak and a valley within the profile element exceed the threshold values. This can be clearly illustrated with the last profile element, XS16. Although the roughness profile crosses the profile mean line from below to above somewhat earlier, in this case no profile element peak would exceed the threshold value. Therefore, this crossing of the profile mean line is not counted as the boundary of the profile element. Only at the next crossing of the roughness profile through the profile mean line does the profile element include both a profile element valley and a profile element peak beyond the threshold values, and is thus counted as a profile element. In addition to this vertical 10% threshold, there is also a horizontal limit that must not be undershot. Only profile elements whose length is greater than 1% of the evaluation length are actually counted as such. Otherwise, they are also excluded. The average length XS over all n measured profile elements finally yields the mean groove width RSM. In our case, this mean groove width amounts to 0.23 mm. Finally, the recorded surface profile should be examined more closely once again. As previously explained, the scanned surface profile contains different components of short and long wavelength oscillations of the stylus tip. Both the short wavelength, which means high-frequency oscillations due to the stylus tip vibration, as well as the long wavelength, which means low-frequency oscillations due to surface waviness, must be filtered out. Only in this way is it ensured that only the roughness of the surface is actually captured and used for evaluation. It is easy to see, for example, that the profile heights differ significantly when determined from the primary profile without filtering. While we obtain an average profile height of PZ equals 14.18 for the unfiltered primary profile, the RZ value for the filtered roughness profile is 11.37. Note that the evaluation of surface parameters can actually be performed not only on the roughness profile but, as exemplified here, also on the primary profile or the waviness profile. Parameters determined on the primary profile are then indicated with a capital letter P, and those evaluated on the waviness profile with a capital letter W. In these cases, the RZ value on the roughness profile is referred to as the PZ value when determined on the primary profile, or as the WZ value when determined on the waviness profile. In the case of the WZ value, one does not speak of the maximum height of roughness, but rather of the maximum height of waviness. The same applies analogously to the other familiar surface parameters, which then begin accordingly with the capital letters P, W, or R. Note that the present surface profile strictly speaking does not yet represent a primary profile, as it is still superimposed by noise. Exemplarily, these short wave oscillations can be seen in the diagram as the jitter motion. The example shown fundamentally illustrates that choosing the correct filtering plays a central role in determining roughness parameters, since otherwise the roughness profile still contains components from other influences such as noise, waviness, and form deviations. Therefore, for the roughness profile, short wave oscillations that are not due to roughness but rather caused by vibration influences or noise during measurement must first be filtered out. These are initially removed using an appropriate short-wave filter, a so-called low-pass filter, thereby smoothing the scanned profile. This results in what is called the primary profile. Subsequently, long-wave oscillations that are not due to roughness but rather caused by waviness influences and form deviations of the surface must be filtered out. In the diagram, this long-wave oscillation is exemplarily shown by the red line. The probe essentially oscillates on average along this waviness. These long-wave oscillations are filtered out using a suitable long-wave filter, a so-called high-pass filter, which smooths the primary profile. This results in the actual roughness profile. What is illustrated very clearly and simply in the animation, however, is not so straightforward in practice. Let us therefore take a schematic look at the different wavelengths or frequencies present in an unfiltered probe signal. Note that high frequencies correspond to short wavelengths, and low frequencies correspond to long wavelengths. The probe signal can be imagined like a recorded piece of music, which also contains various frequencies or wavelengths. Each frequency represents a specific tone. Short wavelength, high-frequency signals correspond to high tones, and long wavelength, low-frequency signals correspond to low tones. Filtering a probe signal works basically like filtering a sound signal. Similar to an equalizer, which dampens certain frequencies or wavelength components in a recorded music to create a specific sound, unwanted wavelength components in the recorded surface probe signal can also be dampened using special profile filters. Noise influences in the scanned surface signal basically correspond to high tones, while form deviations correspond to low tones. In between lies the transition from roughness to waviness. The noise is now attenuated with a low-pass filter, which essentially allows only the low frequencies, and thus wavelengths above a certain cutoff frequency, lambda s, to pass through. A filter does not have a sharp cutoff below which signals are completely blocked and above which they are fully transmitted. In the commonly used Gaussian filters, there is always a certain S-shaped transition region. Therefore, the cutoff wavelength is defined as the wavelength at which the signal is attenuated by 50%. Similarly, the low-frequency signals caused by form deviations of the surface are attenuated using a Gaussian filter starting from a cutoff wavelength lambda f with a high-pass filter. These two cutoff wavelengths are usually uncritical because they are relatively far apart and can be well separated. More difficult to define and at the same time of central importance for the reproducibility and comparability of roughness measurements is the threshold between roughness and waviness, as the transition is always gradual. For this separation, a filter with a cutoff wavelength lambda c is used. For roughness, the relevant wavelength range lies between the cutoff wavelengths lambda s and lambda c, while for waviness, the range between the cutoff wavelengths lambda c and lambda f is important. Note that, as previously explained, the familiar surface parameters can be determined not only for the roughness profile, but also for the primary profile or the waviness profile. Therefore, in some cases, it is also important to specifically filter out and analyze the waviness profile. The cutoff wavelength lambda f is especially used for this purpose. According to the new standard, the specified cutoff wavelengths are no longer referred to as wavelengths but as nesting indices NIS, NIC, and NIF, since nonlinear filters are often used which do not have a precise cutoff wavelength in the strict sense. Hence, the more general term nesting index is used. In the following, we will focus on the nesting indices for roughness NIS and NIC, as these are most relevant in most cases. The corresponding filters are called Profile S filter and Profile L filter, respectively. Since the surface roughness to be expected can contain rather long wave or short wave components, the nesting indices of these filters must be chosen accordingly. The new standard defines 5 setting classes SC1 to SC5 with different values, which we will explain in more detail in the following. Depending on which surface parameter and which upper limit is specified, the corresponding setting class must be selected. For example, if a maximum RZ value of 6.3 micrometers is required, setting class SC3 must be chosen. For this class, a nesting index NIC of 0.8 mm for the Profile L filter must be used to separate roughness from waviness. This cutoff wavelength also corresponds to the evaluation length LSC of a single measurement section. This ensures that waviness within one section length is filtered out or at least significantly dampened. 5 of these section lengths then form the evaluation length LE of the entire measurement track. In our case, the evaluation length is therefore 4 mm. The nesting index NIS of the Profile S filter for separating noise in the surface scanning signal is 2.5 micrometers for setting classes SC1 to SC3. Additionally, specific stylus tip radii are prescribed for the various setting classes. In our case, a tip radius of 2 micrometers is specified for the surface measurement. Note that the settings to be used on the profilometer no longer depend, as they did in the past, on the expected surface quality, but rather on the specifications given in the technical drawing. If no specific roughness is specified for a surface but roughness parameters are still to be determined, it is recommended to use setting class SC3, as most roughness values from typical manufacturing processes generally fall within this range. To conclude this video, we will summarize the most important roughness parameters. The total height RT indicates the profile height within which all roughness features lie. It corresponds to the vertical distance between the deepest valley and the highest peak within the entire evaluation length. The maximum height RZ corresponds to the average maximum height of the roughness over 5 section lengths, each measured from the deepest valley to the highest peak within one section length. This parameter was formerly referred to as the average roughness depth. The largest of the 5 individual profile heights was referred to as Rmax in the old standard. In the new standard, this parameter is replaced by RZX and is called the maximum height per section. This value is determined by the maximum profile height within a moving section length along the total evaluation length. In this case, the Rmax value is significantly lower than the RZX value, as the largest vertical distance between a peak and a valley of the profile lies not within a single defined section length, but spans across the second and third sections. The mean peak height RP, formerly referred to as the smoothing depth, is calculated as the average of the individual peak heights over the 5 section lengths, each measured from the profile's mean line to the respective highest profile peak. Similarly, the mean valley depth RV, formerly referred to as the mean groove depth, is calculated as the average of the valley depths over the 5 section lengths, each measured from the profile's mean line to the respective deepest valley. Note that, with the exception of the total profile height RT, all listed parameters are defined by averaging over 5 section lengths. In contrast, the parameters RA and RQ, which are determined over the profile areas, are defined over the entire evaluation length in the new standard. The arithmetic mean height RA, formerly called the average roughness value, indicates the average deviation of the roughness from the mean line. Visually, this parameter corresponds to the height of a rectangular area that has the same surface area as the profile peaks and valleys above and below the profile mean line. Compared to the less informative RA value, the root mean square height RQ gives significantly more weight to individual outliers due to the squaring of the roughness values. This parameter represents the standard deviation of the surface roughness profile and is thus particularly well suited for statistical evaluations of surface texture. Let us now turn to the parameters that describe the material ratio of the surface roughness. The core height RK of the roughness core profile is determined as the vertical distance between the points where the regression line of the material ratio curve intersects the diagram axes. The reduced peak height RPK corresponds to the height of a triangle that has the same area as the profile peaks above the roughness core profile, with the base of the triangle corresponding to the material ratio RMRK1. Analogously, the reduced valley depth RVK is defined as the height of a triangle that has the same area as the profile valleys below the roughness core profile, with the base of the triangle corresponding to the distance between the material ratio RMRK2 and the diagram axis at 100% material ratio. The material ratio RMRK2 corresponds to the highest material ratio of the roughness core profile, while RMRK1 represents the lowest material ratio. Note that the reference line for specifying a cutting depth C does not necessarily have to relate to the highest profile peak. In the present case, the reference level lies at approximately 3% material ratio. This material ratio at the reference level is also referred to as the reference material ratio. This approach makes sense, since for example it can be assumed that the highest profile peaks are already flattened and no longer exist after a single load on the surface. If a certain material ratio at a certain cutting depth is required, it is therefore essential that the definition of the reference line or the reference material ratio is also specified. The illustrated example shows a possible surface specification. We will decode this together in the following. First, the tolerance type is indicated. In our case, the letter L stands for a lower limit of the subsequent parameter, which must not be undershot. In this case, it is the relative material ratio RMR of the roughness profile. A material ratio of at least 60% is required here. This specification refers to the values in parentheses. That is, the minimum material ratio of 60% must be present at a cutting depth of 3 micrometers. The reference level of this cutting depth lies at 5% material ratio. That means at 5% material ratio, the cutting depth is set to 0 and thus forms the reference level. Next, the tolerance acceptance rule to be used is specified in the surface specification. In our case, the so-called 16% rule applies. This means that the surface is still considered acceptable if no more than 16% of all measured values fall below the required surface quality. Therefore, 84% of the measured points on the surface must have at least 60% material ratio at a depth of 3 micrometers. The surface is then deemed acceptable. If no measured value is allowed to fall below the required surface quality, this is indicated by the designation Tmax. At this point, a new feature of the current standard comes into play. While the 16% rule was the standard in the old standard unless otherwise specified, the max rule is now the default in the new standard. Additionally, a new rule called the median tolerance acceptance rule TMED has been introduced. This rule basically states that at least half of the measured values must comply with the limit. The median rule is applied, for example, when a strong variation in the measured values is expected. After defining the tolerance acceptance rule, the type of the profile S filter is indicated in the surface specification, separated by a slash. In our case, A so-called robust S-spline filter with a nesting index NIS of 0.0025 mm is used. This is followed by, separated by a dash, the specification of the type of the profile L filter. In our case, a robust Gaussian filter with a nesting index NIC of 0.5 mm. Next, in parentheses, the evaluation length is specified, which in this case is 8 mm. Following that, the method and type of the profile F operator are indicated. In the present case, the LS method with a nesting index NIF is used as a circle diameter with a radius of 50 mm. Finally, the surface measurement method is given, separated by a slash. In our case, the surface roughness is measured electromagnetically. The standard method would be a mechanical measurement by the up and down movement of a stylus. However, in our case, this is done electromagnetically. The general structure of a surface specification is defined in the new standard as shown. If the setting classes according to the standard are used by default and other standard settings are also applied, then only the characteristic value and the associated limit at the positions of the red-marked placeholders B and C must be specified as mandatory.